us.
Please welcome John Llewellyn Probert.
Right, thank you very much. I am indeed reading a story from Wicked Delights, but it was originally published by dear Charlie Black in the 5th Black Book of Horror. This is 2 for dinner, and I think it's rather delightful that it has been put on just before dinner, because I'm not sure what it'll do to your appetites, but let's see, shall we? Right. So, I suppose you're a fan of Beethoven and all that sort of noisy bollocks, are you? Marcus Randall cut a thin strip from his exquisitely prepared steak and thrust the severed portion into his mouth. As he chewed, he placed his elbows on the damask covering of the antique Georgian table and rested his chin on immaculately manicured hands. The light from the chandelier above glinting off both his gold wedding band and the heavy signet ring on his left little finger. The much younger man at whom this comment had been addressed looked up at his dining companion with a slightly pained expression. Julian Partleton had been out of university for 3 years, but the company he had kept, both there and since leaving, was more inclined to discuss the finer points of classical music with elan rather than expletives. He had to cough to clear the nerves from his throat before he could reply. I think it's important to keep an open mind about all kinds of music, he said, still feeling too uncomfortable to eat much of the food that had been placed before him. Worried about incurring his host's displeasure, he picked up his silver fork, only for it to slip from between fingers slick with anxious sweat. It fell to the floor, the thick pile of the Persian rug beneath their feet, so thick and luxurious that the ornately engraved utensil barely made a sound as it landed. "You've dropped your fork," said Randall, unnecessarily and with obvious pleasure. "Yes, sorry," said Julian, bending down. "Oh, for God's sake, don't pick it up," said his host, regarding his companion's bobbing shock of curly brown hair. "I'll get Hopkins to fetch you another." The butler was summoned by a crimson silken pull cord to Randall's right, the like of which Julian had only seen in BBC Regency dramas. Tugging at the soft material produced a far-off clanging that signified the activation of some ancient but still functioning system of letting the servants know when they were wanted. For someone who looked nearly 70, Hopkins arrived remarkably quickly, left without saying a word, and returned almost as rapidly with a replacement utensil. Then he was gone again to leave the 2 men to discuss whatever it was Julian had been summoned to Randall's mansion to talk about. They ate in silence for the next couple of minutes, Julian finding his steak easier to eat than he had been expecting, but then it had been prepared to standards better than he had ever enjoyed in a restaurant. Not that a music teacher's salary allowed him to take his wife out to anywhere even remotely expensive. And yet, Jenny never complained, which was just one of the many things he often failed to appreciate about her. "I make a point of employing a first-class chef," said Randall, taking a swig from a large glass that was on its way to being emptied of a particularly fine Bordeaux for the 2nd time that evening. "Well, if you can afford it, why not?" said Julian, hoping he hadn't overstepped the mark. "Exactly!" his host beamed in agreement. "Having spent so much time amassing a vast personal fortune, it only makes sense that I should feel I deserve the best. The best food, the best wine, the best clothes." And here he held up his arm to better display the elegantly cut black velvet jacket he was wearing that evening. "And, of course, the very best music teacher for Adrian." Julian smiled at the compliment and inwardly breathed a sigh of relief. So that was why he was here. To discuss how Randall's 7-year-old was doing at his piano lessons. Thank God. But then, what else, he reassured himself, could Randall have possibly wanted to talk about? "He's a bright boy, Mr. Randall, and I'm sure you know that already." "Of course I do," said Randall, spearing the last roast potato on his plate and popping it whole into his mouth. "But then, you're a very bright boy as well, aren't you, Mr. Partleton? Music scholar at Canterbury, wasn't it?" "An organ scholar, to be precise," said Julian. Randall emptied his glass and poured another from the second bottle that had been opened. "That's right, I do beg your pardon. One of those big church things, I'll bet. Sort that keeps your hands and feet busy. It does take quite a lot of skill to master it, said Julian. As he started to relax, he suddenly realised how hungry he was. He began to tuck into the meal with relish. It was only when he was coming to the end that he realised that Randall had been watching him eat without uttering a word. "Did you enjoy that?" said the older man once he had swallowed the last mouthful. "You know, I have to admit I did," said Julian, wiping his mouth on a white napkin whose embroidered edge could have been gold lace for all he knew. Randall fingered his glass. "And you're feeling a little more relaxed now, I sincerely hope." Julian nodded. "Are we going to have dessert first, or would you prefer to let the food go down and discuss Adrian's progress now?" "Oh, it's not Adrian I brought you here to discuss," said Randall. "It's you. Or rather, you and my wife." Julian's stomach would have flipped over if it hadn't been so full. "Oh, God," he thought. Randall knew, after all. He knew, and Julian should never have come here. He should never have been so stupid as to accept a dinner invitation from this man. But he had so very few pupils at the moment, and Randall paid so well that he hadn't wanted to risk upsetting him. And Jenny, lovely Jenny, his wife, to whom he'd been married these past 3 years, had insisted that he go. But then, she hadn't known about his brief affair with Angela Randall. Which Angela's husband obviously did. The man who was his employer. The man glaring at him from the other side of the table. The man he needed to get away from now. Except that he couldn't. For some reason, his arms had been replaced by lead weights, and when he tried to move his legs, it felt as if they'd been glued to his chair. He tried to speak, but this time only a slurred groan managed to escape his lips. "I wondered when the drug in your drink would start to work," said Randall, getting to his feet and making his way slowly to the other end of the table. "You know, that's one of the marvellous things about lack of breeding. You wouldn't know this." He picked up his nearly empty wine glass. "From the rather less than exclusive piss I've been letting you drink all evening. I see I was right in not wasting the good stuff on you. Christ, all you have to do with some people is tell them that they're drinking something posh and they believe you. No wonder so many restaurants these days turn a profit so easily if ignorant peasants like you patronise them. And there's no point trying to reply. Your vocal cords should be all but paralysed by now. And in a minute, you'll be asleep." By now, his face was inches from Julian's own. "And when you wake up, my friend, let me assure you that you will find yourself in rather less comfortable surroundings." Julian came round to find himself in a large, empty room lined with bare bricks. Bare, that is, except for the broad wooden workbench at the far end, the one in front of which Randall was currently standing. "Ah, awake, are you?" said his captor. Julian tried to speak and was surprised to find he wasn't gagged. He took a deep breath and screamed. "Oh, good grief, that's not going to do you any good," said Randall. "Do you honestly think I would have left you with the capacity to speak if anyone might be able to hear you? You drove here in that clapped-out little car of yours. You saw how isolated this place is. And don't think the servants will hear you. I've sent them all home and the nearest lives 5 miles away. So, just to summarise, in case things aren't absolutely crystal clear, you and I are alone, miles from anywhere, in a position where we can now have a little chat, man to man. Well, man to cheating, philandering bastard, who happens to be tied to a chair in front of me." Julian had felt too fragile before, but now he realised that he could move neither his arms nor his legs. He looked down to see that he had been tied to the chair with what looked like wire. "It's piano wire, actually," said Randall with a grin. "Cut from the very same Kemble ground at which you have sat so many times, teaching my little Adrian that middle C is on this line and all those other interminably dreary music exercises he has in that book of his.